On behalf of the Adult Education Committee, I want to thank you all for coming to our faith conversation with Dr. Reinhard Krauss. Dr. Krauss is a theologian and lecturer at several institutions, including UCLA and New Theological Seminary of the West. He holds a degree in theology from the University of Tübingen in Germany, as well as a Ph.D. in religious studies from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He's currently the executive director of the Academy for Judaic, Christian, and Islamic Studies, which is dedicated to building bridges of understanding, mutual respect, and cooperation between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And perhaps most relevant to our topic today, Dr. Krauss also served as an academic translator and editorial board member on the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Translation Project, a decades-long endeavor that produced the definitive English editions of Bonhoeffer's entire collected works, which subsequently changed the landscape of theological studies across the globe. And as someone who's, for the past several years, been engaged in a Ph.D. project on Bonhoeffer, I'm very grateful and feel very indebted to Dr. Krauss, because it means I can read him mostly in English and slog through a little less German, which is wonderful. So thank you for that. In our fall small groups over the last several weeks, many of us at WPC read and contemplated Bonhoeffer's spiritual classic, Life Together, drinking deeply from his rich and theologically nuanced conceptions of community and common life. Today, we are so blessed to host a true Bonhoeffer scholar who will help us to better understand the abiding relevance of Bonhoeffer's life, work, and faith for the church today. Friends, please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Reinhard Krauss.
Thank you for this warm introduction. It's indeed a pleasure to be back here at Westwood Presbyterian Church, and I'm not sure I'm a Bonhoeffer scholar. I like to say, being involved for over 10 years with translating Dietrich Bonhoeffer, while also being a pastor, I marinated in Bonhoeffer. And I think it influenced my thinking, my preaching, and as Jake says, I now serve as with an interreligious organization. I want to, when Jake asked me, invited me to be here, I gladly accepted, but I also wanted to say, what slice of Bonhoeffer shall we look at? Because it's just going to be a little glimpse. So he said that some of you, many of you perhaps, had read Life Together, which is written, as you read, in a particular context for his underground seminary that he led. And so, but I also thought when we talked, maybe it would be helpful to get some glimpses of Bonhoeffer's life. What is the context in which this man lived, who is still relevant today? And then what I would like to do is to ask one of the questions that Bonhoeffer penned in a letter to his best friend, Eberhard Bethge, when he was incarcerated in prison. And that is the question, who is Jesus Christ for us today? And that is certainly a question that needs to be relevant for us, and the context in which he asked the question is very startling. And I would argue it is startling and continues to be startling for me, for us, because you will see. I brought a couple of books, and you feel free to look at them afterwards. One of my most treasured possessions is this book, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, A Life in Pictures, which was given to me by my friend Kathy Porter many years ago, and I rediscovered the inscription. So it's wonderful to see you, Kathy. So marvelous pictures in here. Thick books. This is the new enlarged biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I would highly recommend it to you if you really want to see the granularity of his life. It was written by his best friend Dietrich Bethge, to whom he wrote the letters from prison, and it's recently, maybe about 5 years ago, been enlarged with additional materials. I would recommend this if you really have some time. This is a copy of the letters and papers from prison. The fact that this book is so fat is it was originally edited by German scholars, and German scholars like footnotes. So if you open it anywhere, sometimes half the page, like here, is footnotes. And say, but you will find out everything about the sources, the condition of the letter, in some cases the ink. So Germans really like to be meticulous. So it was a joy and very thought-provoking to be involved in the translation of these texts, of these letters, and as I said, to marinate in Bonhoeffer's theology. And last but not least, if you want to, this is a marvelous sampler of Bonhoeffer's writings. It's called the Bonhoeffer Reader. It was put together by two leading Bonhoeffer scholars about 10 years ago. It's also very inexpensive, but it has some of the essential writings and excerpts of writings by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, so I can highly recommend it as a sample. So, without further ado, if you have any questions in between, don't hesitate to ask. And as we said, this is only going to be a glimpse, so I prepared a PowerPoint presentation with some pictures. And it was also wonderful for me because I learned to reuse PowerPoint, which I haven't used for a number of years. So the topic, this is Bonhoeffer's signature. Who is Jesus Christ for us today? So who was Dietrich Bonhoeffer? He was born in 1906 on February 4th, and he died on April 9th, 1945. You probably have heard he was executed by the Nazis. Who was he? He was a very complex person, and if you read Bonhoeffer, if you read about Bonhoeffer, you will continue to discover facets. And he himself penned a famous poem in prison when he said, "Who am I? I don't understand myself." And in the end, he said, "Who am I? You, God, know who I am." So the complexity was also something he was very aware of. He was a pastor in a congregation. He was a theologian at the time. He died at age 39, but even at the time, he was already very well known. He was a teacher. He led an underground seminary for the Confessing Church in Germany. The Confessing Church was the church that opposed the Hitler government. He was a leader in that movement in the Confessing Church. He eventually became a member of the German resistance, the conspiracy and attempt on Hitler's life. He was involved despite being a pacifist, and lots have been written and people have been pondered. He was a prisoner of conscience. 2 days after Hitler was appointed, he gave a radio address saying the Führer principle has no place in the church, and in the middle of that radio address, the station cut him off. So it didn't take him long to speak up, and he became a prisoner of conscience. And he was a Christian and a human being. And those, as we will see, are perhaps the most important attributes that he would claim for himself. Bonhoeffer's parents. Well, let's see. Yeah. Bonhoeffer's parents were Karl and Paula Bonhoeffer. The first picture is shortly after they were married, and the second picture is a picture taken after the war. Now, in the second picture, these are Dietrich Bonhoeffer's parents ice skating in 1943. So things have changed. It's also important to recognize he was a person in a different cultural time and context. I've never seen anybody ice skating like this in formal dress. In 1912, Karl Bonhoeffer, his dad, was appointed as head of the Charité, and this is the first picture, the Royal Prussian Nerve Clinic, as it was called, in Berlin. And it was Germany's most prestigious chair in psychiatry. So he came from an intellectual family of great renown in Germany, and this is the hospital to which Karl Bonhoeffer was appointed. The Bonhoeffers were a family of privilege. They were certainly upper middle class. On the left is the house in Breslau, now in Poland, where Bonhoeffer was born. And then after his dad's appointment in 1912 to the chair in psychiatry in Berlin, this is the home they lived in when Dietrich Bonhoeffer was 6. He was part of a large family. The two little ones is him and his twin sister Sabine at age 3, and they are lined up. So Bonhoeffer is the second from the left. Probably not how pictures that you have seen of Bonhoeffer look. A little closer up. The Bonhoeffer twins. He was born about 10 minutes earlier than his sister, and he teased her about that fact all his life, that he was ahead of her. What is perhaps more important and relevant for us today is that Sabine, his twin sister, married Gerhard Leipolz, who was a judge, and he was Jewish. And so in 1938, the couple had to immigrate to Oxford in England to escape the Holocaust. And so the question of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, was also a very personal question for Dietrich Bonhoeffer because his twin sister had to flee. And then after the war, from 1951 to 1971, Gerhard Leipolz served on the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany. So he attained a very high position after the war. Dietrich at age 11. In 1915, and in the company of his kids, of his siblings. In 1915, when Dietrich was 9, his father wrote in the New Year's diary, "Dietrich does his work naturally and tidily. He likes fighting and does a great deal of it." So his inclination and convictions about pacifism apparently came a little later. Here are the Bonhoeffer children at home playing baptism. they set up a communion table and assembled neighborhood kids, and were playing baptism. The question is, I'm not sure whether it was Dietrich who was officiating here or somebody else, but maybe it was a little inkling at his later vocation. Now, the Bonhoeffers were not a church-going family, but already at age 14, when he was in high school, Dietrich decided and declared to his family that he was going to study theology. And in preparation for that, he enrolled in Hebrew classes in high school. There were high schools in Germany that taught Hebrew. Extraordinary. However, his siblings seriously frowned on this, and his family said this is not really a very respectable profession and study theology. And he was told by his brothers and sisters that the church is, quote, a poor, feeble, boring, petty, and bourgeois institution. Let me say that again. His siblings told him that the church is a poor, feeble, boring, petty, and bourgeois institution. So Dietrich responded to that, well, in that case, I shall reform it. So obviously at age 14, he already had a tremendous self-confidence and sense of what his direction in life would be. At age 70, again extraordinary, he begins studies at the University of Tübingen, which I also got to learn, to see and love as a student myself. You obviously realize that I'm German from my accent, right? And then a year later, he changed to the University of Berlin. At the tender age, I would say, of 21, he finished and published his doctoral dissertation on the church as a community. And it has been one of the most impressive and influential pieces of theology to say the church is essentially, not just accidentally, a community. It's not that we are initially individual Christians and then we come together for this common hobby, the church. But without the church, without the community, there is no such thing as being a Christian. He also called the church in that dissertation Christ existing as community. So the church for him is Christ existing as community in this time after the resurrection and before the second coming. That is a breathtaking vocation if the church is petty, boring, and bourgeois. How can that be happening at the same time? And this is something he wrestled with all his life. In 1930, just 3 years afterwards, he was 24, he did his second Ph.D., which in Germany is required. You have to do two doctoral dissertations to prove that the first one was not a fluke. And then you are licensed to lecture in the subject in which you have written your dissertations. And in 1930, he also decided to study at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And in the picture on the left, he is on the far left, a picture of Union Theological Seminary. And in 1931, he also, or at Union Theological Seminary, he met Jean Lassalle, a French student, and they became very close friends. And Jean Lassalle introduced him to the concept, the radical concept of pacifism, that war is unacceptable for a Christian according to the teachings of Jesus. And this made a very deep impression throughout his life for Dietrich, and he decided to go on a trip, and this is a little nugget. They bought an old car and drove from New York City all the way to Mexico together. So there's some pictures in this book that you can see how they camped out of the car. After the return from the United States, he became a university lecturer in Berlin and also a pastor in training. The picture on the left is a picture with his confirmation class. And he had a great love and compassion for youth and for relationships. And the confirmation class was in a rather poor neighborhood. Also, he had a ferocious interest in things that were not part of his social class and orbit. For example, in New York City, he visited Abyssinian Baptist Church, a large African-American congregation, and taught Sunday school class there, and then brought gospel music back on records and played it later to his students at the Finkenwald Seminary, and they were absolutely astonished, being used to German folk and yodel music. He was a chaplain at the Technical University in Berlin, and he posted notices of the meetings, and the notices were torn down repeatedly, vandalism. So he penned, and this is his handwriting, and I just want to share it with you as a little glimpse of his work and ministry. He penned this note that he put up after the third time his notice was torn down. To the fellow student who thought he would have to take down this placard for the third time. Dear fellow student, why act so secretly? Why always the same joke? Or why are you so annoyed? I'm convinced that you and I are the poor and are missing an important experience if our relationship continues to be so impersonal. Why not come and see me instead? Perhaps we would not find talking to one another so difficult. So rather than call the police, this was his reaction. Did I miss one? No. In 1935, as I said, Bonhoeffer was involved in the opposition against Hitler, and in 1935, he was commissioned by the Confessing Church to lead an underground seminary. So the first picture on the left is the graduation class, and you notice it's all men at the time. That's why in many of the books he says the brothers, and in many cases we wrestled with that during translation, saying, does he really mean brothers? In this case, yes, it was only brothers, because women were not ordained as pastors at the time in the Protestant church, but in most cases we translated brothers and sisters, because this is what Bonhoeffer clearly had in mind. In 1937, after 2 years, the seminary was closed by the Gestapo, and many former pastors and former students were arrested. Already in the year before, in August 1936, Bonhoeffer was forbidden to teach at Berlin University, and it was canceled his appointment was canceled by the Nazi government. In 1938, a year later, he made first contact through family members with members of the German resistance who eventually planned the attempt on Hitler's life that failed in 1944. And as I already said, his twin sister by that time and her Jewish husband and 2 daughters had emigrated to Oxford in England. In 1940, Bonhoeffer is forbidden to speak in public and is required to work regularly to the police. During this time, he's working on his ethics. You brought a copy. And we didn't plan this. This is the book, the latest book that Bonhoeffer worked on before his arrest and death. And the manuscript was actually on the desk you see in the picture. He didn't finish it, but it is very clear that when you read it within the historical context, that Bonhoeffer really wrestled with the questions of his life. How, as a pacifist, he can be involved in taking another person's life. What does that mean for him as a Christian? And obviously, these are not obvious issues that he addresses, but if you read between the lines, it's very obvious that he wrestled with those questions. And in 1941, Bonhoeffer then is also forbidden to publish. This is the house where the Bonhoeffer house where his parents moved after their retirement. And this is a picture of his study in that house. It is now dedicated to Bonhoeffer's memory. You can visit it. I sat in that chair some 20 years ago, and it was a very moving experience. This was the desk where Bonhoeffer worked on his ethics when the Gestapo came and took him away to prison. He stayed at his parents' house, and this was a study, and it has been left the way it was, and it is now a house dedicated to Bonhoeffer studies and to continue his legacy.
That's in Berlin?
That's in Berlin, yes. Yes, I can give you the address. You can, yes. It's really quite amazing when you read Bonhoeffer's texts to actually visit his study and know the place. Again, this is the biography, to read how the arrest and everything happened, how the Gestapo showed up and arrested him, and he left his papers and the ethics unfinished. And so he was incarcerated in 1943 on April 5th in Tegel prison in Berlin. And this is a picture of the small window from his cell. And pictures from the courtyard of the Tegel prison. Bonhoeffer in the middle, and the other one is also a picture that's close up. In October 19... Yeah?
Was Bonhoeffer friendly with any Jewish professors in Germany, and did he have to leave behind those friends? What was his, aside from his sister's husband, what was his connection to the Jewish community?
His connection to the Jewish community, and this could be another whole lecture, was that some pastors who were Jewish by origin but had converted to Christianity and were pastors were forbidden by the Nazis, and their job was canceled, and so it became a huge discussion in the confessing church. Should we follow what was called the Arian paragraph, namely that these brothers, it was no women, should lose their job because they are Jewish by ancestry but had become Christian? Because for the Nazis it was a racial question, not a lonely voice in speaking up for Jewish brothers and sisters.
One of the reasons I ask is because in Judaism, the notion of community is all powerful.
Yes.
And I wondered whether he had friends, Jewish friends with whom he discussed that idea with.
Again. In 19...
A little homework.
Yes, in 1944, Bonhoeffer is then moved to the infamous Gestapo prison in Berlin. And he is then transported on April 8th, 1945, and the trial is held in that building, a summary trial on command from Adolf Hitler himself. And after a short trial, he is the next day executed in Flossenburg concentration camp in Bavaria. Less than a month later, on May 7th, Germany unconditionally surrenders to the Allies. So it was just less than a month before the end of the war. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer's last words, which he conveyed to Bishop Bell in England via a British spy who was incarcerated with him, were, "This is the end, for me, the beginning of life."
Wow.
Those are the last words that we have from him. Bonhoeffer still speaks. He still speaks through his writings, and especially through the letters from prison that he wrote to his best friend Eberhard Bethge, who is pictured here. He was initially a student, Eberhard Bethge, but then became a very close friend and confidant. And Bonhoeffer wrote some of his innermost thoughts and ideas and his anguish in letters to Eberhard Bethge. And they're collected in the letters and papers from prison. They contain letters, letters from and to his parents, letters from and to Eberhard Bethge, but also theological reflections and poems. And I would like to share a very brief excerpt from a letter that he wrote to Eberhard Bethge. And I don't know whether you can read it, so let me read it to you. It's a letter from April 30th, 1944. What might surprise or perhaps even worry you would be my theological thoughts and where they're leading. And here is where I really miss you very much. I don't know anyone else with whom I can talk about them and arrive at some clarity. What keeps gnawing at me is the question, what is Christianity? Or who is Jesus Christ actually for us today? The age when we could tell people that with words, whether with theological or with pious words, is past, as is the age of inwardness and of conscience, and that means the age of religion altogether. We are approaching a completely religionless age. People as they are now simply cannot be religious anymore. Even those who honestly describe themselves as religious aren't really practicing that at all. This was written some 70 years ago. It is very prescient when we live in an age where people are less and less and less religious, but instead of moving inward, turning inward, becoming more pious in prison, he is turning in a radically different direction and saying religion is no longer applicable, people are no longer religious. And he, in subsequent letters, writes a lot about that religion is in some sense for people who don't have answers. And you bring God out of, he calls it Deus ex machina, the God who serves the gaps. of our knowledge. And as our knowledge increases, God becomes less and less and less important. And he says, if that is the case, then Christianity and religion is no longer relevant, and it will go away, it will vanish. And he says this in the solitude and loneliness of his cell. But he is burning with the question of saying, what does Jesus Christ mean for us today in that age? So in the 60s, Bonhoeffer's comments about religionless Christianity spawned a whole school of writing about the death of God. It's the greatest misunderstanding, because saying religion is going away, but what does Jesus Christ mean for us today? The two are held together in tension, and so he understands Jesus not as being able to be captured in dogmas, in theological statements, in propositions, but as a living reality here and now. And this is the statement he wrestled with in ethics, to say, I am called as a Christian to stand before God and act like Jesus. I am called to embody the same spirit that Jesus embodied and showed us, not just in words. And I cannot hide behind ethical principles. I cannot hide behind theological propositions or confessions. I stand alone before God, and I have to make the decision and then be judged. For example, again, when you read between the lines in his ethics, he says, taking another human life, like he was planning to do and involved with Hitler, saying, nobody can excuse this. Collateral damage, unequivocally God commanded us not to take a human life. And I will, in individual responsibility, need to make that decision and stand before God as guilty before the God who said, you shall not take a human life. So he goes close to what some passages in the Bible call, he is willing to risk his own salvation, so to speak, in order to do what he feels called and compelled to do. It's extraordinary, because we would say, oh, yeah, Hitler is responsible for the death of so many human beings, and therefore it's justified. Bonhoeffer never goes there in his ethics. He says it's always a sin, and I will commit that sin, so to speak, and stand before God and be judged. So Bonhoeffer takes it seriously what he already wrote in his doctoral dissertation, The Church Existing as Community, namely that Christ is embodied. We are called as the church to embody the Christ, to embody Jesus. For him that means we need to study the Gospels. Christ for him is not just the placeholder, it is the Jesus who blessed the peacemakers. It is the Jesus who turned the other cheek, who said, do not return evil for evil, and who said, blessed are the poor. And Bonhoeffer takes this very seriously, that we are not just what would Jesus do, but you all be little Jesuses. We all need to be little Jesuses. We need to embody the Spirit of Jesus here and now, not with confessions. And so let me quote from another letter from July 18th, 1944. Being a Christian does not mean being religious. in a certain way, making oneself into something or other, a sinner, penitent, or a saint, according to some method or other. Instead, it means being human. Not a certain type of being human, but the human being Christ creates in us. That is conversion, turning around. Not thinking first of one's own needs, questions, sins, and fears, but allowing oneself to be pulled into walking the path that Jesus walks. So Bonhoeffer becomes very radical in his last letters from prison to say, Jesus didn't come to make us Christian. Jesus came to make us human. And what it means to be human, you need to see and study and follow and practice in the Gospels and follow him to the cross. It seems to be after many reflections that he had, he seems to come back at the end of his life to this radical message and the conclusion, that's what Jesus Christ means for us today. So, I want to just, we have a few more minutes, open it up for comments, questions, disagreements. Yes?
So he's in prison in 1943. He's eventually executed in 1945 allegedly for participating in the July 20, 1944 attempt to assassinate Hitler.
Right.
So how did he get killed for a crime he couldn't possibly have been implicated in?
Yes, that's an interesting question. He was deeply involved with the conspiracy and the preparation for the conspiracy. He was arrested not for being involved in the conspiracy, but for helping, and this is another answer to your question, for helping some Jews escape to Switzerland, which was not such a crime that you would be executed for at the time. So he was incarcerated, interrogated, but he was fearful that the plot, whether it would come about or that the plot would be discovered. And the papers eventually were hidden in a library at the outskirts of Berlin. And at the end of, I think it's the end of 1944 or early 1945, the Nazis discovered those papers. The conspirators thought they should keep documentation in case the plot succeeded, so they could prove to the Allies that that they were behind the plot to assassinate Hitler and perhaps be allowed to form a new German government. So he was hoping in terror that this would not be discovered, but initially he was not arrested for his involvement in the plot. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have a very personal interest. My father actually was a member of the Confessing Church and knew Bonhoeffer. He was a pastor, born in 1901, a pastor outside of Berlin in Falkenrede, and in church would comment on different things against the Nazis and ended up in Dachau.
Oh.
And so every time I hear Bonhoeffer, I'm actually writing a book about his experience.
Your father's?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He eventually died. Not when he came out of a concentration camp because he had a heart condition and he was practically dead, so they let him out. But he wasn't allowed to preach anymore where he had been near Berlin. They sent him further east, Pomerania, which eventually became Poland, and that's where he was picked up by the Russians when he was on his way to an old man who was dying. And he had a tattoo of his number on it. It didn't matter, you know. So 3 weeks later, he was dead. So this has been haunting me all my life.
Yes, this is very, very, very personal.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And many of his Bonhoeffer students, was he a student in Finkenwalde, your dad?
No. His father was a baker. He was actually from Brandenburg.
Okay.
And when he was 14, he had rheumatic fever, and the doctor recommended he should study a trade.
Right.
But he was totally impractical, so eventually, enough with that. He studied theology in Berlin, and then.
But the courage at that time to be a pastor of the confessing church, and many pastors of the confessing church were arrested and also incarcerated in concentration.
It's the humanitarian aspect.
Yes.
You know, there were so many
Yes.
who just couldn't let it be what was happening in Germany.
And the question that Bonhoeffer and his students agonized over at the Finkenwalde Seminary is, when the draft comes, will we follow? Will we allow ourselves to be posted on the front? It was also a very personal question for him. And eventually he got a job in the military counterintelligence as part of the conspiracy circle.
Mm-hmm.
But from the outside, his friends did not understand. How can he work for the Nazi government, so to speak? And so it was the perception of what he was doing, to be involved and employed by the Nazi government, and thereby also avoiding the draft and being sent to the front, was another agonizing choice for him, because he could of course not say, I'm employed to work for the conspiracy, which he did. He, because of his international connections, he was sent to Switzerland and England to make contact with, try to make contact with the British government, and to say, there is a conspiracy afoot. Would you allow, if the conspiracy succeeds, stop short of unconditional surrender and have the conspirators become the new German government? So he was the emissary, but of course, or not of course, the British government, Churchill, was not sure whether this was not a setup.
I know my father was secretly ordained in the confessing
Yes.
church. And also they met like every month in Berlin and talked about possibilities, what to do.
Yes.
Secretly, all in secret. Yeah.
You should be here up front. So, yes.
Did Bonhoeffer talk in one of those many volumes about if he was saying that the church was religious or we were becoming religious less, did he talk about what the church's role should be in that, or be in supporting the community? Or what religion, what?
This is a beautiful segue.
Thank you.
I have some, I thought, how can we do this? But I copied some passages from his letters when he talked about religionless Christianity. For example, he says, the church, first of all, needs to give away all property, that all pastors need to live from voluntary donations by the congregation, which is the practice here, and they should also have a job like Paul. So he had some radical ideas, but the idea was that the church should be the embodiment of Jesus in the world, to be human. And he says, at times when he talks, and this is one of the quotes, at times when he talks with fellow prisoners, when they start talking in religious, devotional language, it makes him very uneasy. And at other times, people who are secular and have no religious background, he finds it himself to be quite comfortable to talk about God in a natural way. And I don't know, maybe you have had similar experiences. I have. Sometimes people from my fellow tribe make me uneasy, and people who are secular and atheists, I think are, we call it now perhaps more spiritual. But what Bonhoeffer is getting at, to say what the Christian church is about, again, is not to be, Jesus didn't come to make us Christian. Jesus came to make us human. And what it means to be human is to be like Jesus, to follow him to the cross. And it's a living reality that you cannot encapsulate in statements, theological propositions, confessions. It needs to be a lived reality. And that is really a challenge that I think he put out in Life Together in a different way, in discipleship. What it means to follow Jesus is not something that can be put in a book and to say, this is it. It is a daily responsibility to say, what does it mean to follow Jesus? What would Jesus do? And not just what would he do. That's my calling to do right now. And a theme in that is to say Jesus was radically the human being for others. He gave himself away without condition, without counting the cost, without care for his own safety, to speak truth to power, whatever you may call it, but to say, what does it mean to follow Jesus? So in a sense, he's getting back to the very core of the gospel, which he thinks we have overlaid with all kinds of, doctrines, the Book of Order, confirmation classes, whatever. But he is at the end of his life, and I think still has the message for us, who is Jesus Christ for us today, very relevant. I think it's the heart of the gospel. Yeah.
You don't have to answer this because it really is not today, but when you are with your Muslim, Jewish, and Christian young people, is that what they are thinking now? For them, it's to be human? You don't have to, you could just say no.
I would say so. I would say young people are less and less and less religious, but they're passionately engaged in questions of justice, in compassion, in relationships, all the things Jesus was about. And I think it's particularly relevant in the current moment with the horrible bloodshed in the Holy Land. What would Jesus do? Would Jesus turn the other cheek? Is armed resistance justified? Those are very relevant questions that Bonhoeffer, I would argue, still speaks to us today, loud and clear, if we're willing to listen. I like to hang out with young people all the time. So
We have time for maybe one more question.
okay. Yeah.
It occurs to me that this view of what Jesus would do and this kind of radical view is consistent with the role of a martyr, which at some point Bonhoeffer must have accepted. I mean, he must have known that to continue along the road that he was on could result in the loss of his life for this higher principle. It's a little more difficult for, if you're not going to go on the cross, it's a little harder to embrace that wholeheartedly.
So the question then would be, what did Jesus mean when he said, take up your cross, and follow me? I don't think he meant your cross to be the neighbor who's nagging us. or somebody who's building the fence a little too close, or, but to say, what does it mean to live radically for others without fear, or Bonhoeffer was definitely afraid, without fear for your own safety, to be the person for others. Where it will lead, he says ultimately that's what transcendence is about. And again, I would recommend you or encourage you to read some of those quotes. It leads us into the arms of God. That is what transcendence is. It's not a life after death. It means following Jesus into the arms of God. That's what resurrection is. I would maybe like to close with this. When in December 31st, 1944, Bonhoeffer wrote a poem that was intended as a New Year's message to his family and friends. And it was smuggled out of prison and has become Bonhoeffer's, one of Bonhoeffer's best known texts. I'm sure you have probably sung it in church, but let me read it. This was on New Year's Eve, 1944. By gracious powers so wonderfully sheltered, and confidently waiting come what may, we know that God is with us night and morning, and never fails to greet us each new day. Yet is this heart by its old foe tormented. Still evil days bring burdens hard to bear. Oh, give our frightened souls the sure salvation for which, O Lord, you taught us to prepare. And when this cup you give is filled to brimming with bitter suffering hard to understand, we take it thankfully and with a trembling out of so good and so beloved a hand. Yet when again in this same world you give the joy we had, the brightness of your Son, we shall remember all the days we lived through, and our whole life shall then be yours alone. By gracious powers so faithfully protected, so quietly, so wonderfully near, I live each day in hope with you beside me, and go with you through every coming year.